It's been a while, especially on this channel or this series or documentation, whatever you want to call it. I don't like calling it a podcast because I feel like it's much more than a podcast. I began Unpacked as a outlet, a creative outlet. Luckily I had my senior capstone, and it was something to do for that, but I wanted it to be so much more, and I didn't even look at it as a project. I just looked at it as something that I wanted to do. It was birthed off just simply an idea of becoming a sports reporter and creating a blog on sports, but through brainstorming and time, spoken with a teacher and, myself and God, I realized that I feel like sports, I have a lot more to offer than sports. I have a lot more to offer than, who won the game or the players that may have been affected. I've always been a person, I want to know the backstory. I want to know why. I want to know how deep it goes. What made this, and why this, and double entendres or something like are part of literature or whatever category you want to put it into that I've always loved. Drake, J. Cole, they always have lyrics that you read on the surface, but they go so much deeper. And that's something that I always loved. So when I, birthed the idea of Unpacked, I started, what is something to unpack? What is Unpacked? Unpacking is when you open your bag and, your gym bag, your school bag, and you're just unpacking it, from a day, or maybe you want to clean it out and you find a lot of things that weren't there or you didn't know was there. A lot of things that brought you happiness or may have even brought you sadness. And that kind of birthed the idea of Unpacked. In my own life, there are countless moments that I can look back on or I can pick out and talk about that, molded my life. A lot of moments that, you may not talk about in a regular conversation, and a lot of moments you just may not get to share, and that birthed Unpacked. I knew I had a story to tell, or I had stories that helped mold me into who I am today, or continue to mold me to who I am today. But I know a lot of people have that, and not just athletes, creatives, business owners, whatever the case may be. Everybody has a story to tell, and everybody has circumstances that they had to overcome that help shape them and understand what they, are doing, or help them be better at what they're doing. Unpack began May 2025, excuse me. And this is before I knew, my ACL was going to get blown out, on a random day on September 13th in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. This was birthed at right before the most fun I had playing my own sport, the most fun I had, just looking at life, understanding life, working a job and knowing this job isn't something I see myself doing in a long time, or just jobs in this scheme of, I feel like I can do more. I know I can do more, and this was birthed way before that. This was birthed so early that this was fresh out of school of an idea. And now, almost a year later, a lot of foundation, a lot of breaks have been taken there, but a lot of rebuilding has been done. What Unpacked was built on, it's still the foundation, but a lot of things have been added that have made this foundation stronger, just through capstone. I'm glad I used it as my capstone because I was able to understand that, I had a surface level idea of what I wanted to do, but when things get hard as they did, or when things aren't working as they did, how am I going to fall back, or what am I going to fall back on? I had periods where Unpacked was flowing, where I was doing episodes, where I was reaching out to people, and then even with the ACL surgery, I still had that period where I was still going through it. We introduced solo episodes, and, I still had conversations, but once really things hit the fan of having surgery and graduating college, it was just, how can I keep doing Unpacked, where now I feel like the foundation that I built it on is all crumbled. For me, it's hard to speak about what I'm actively going through. It's hard to put out a fire while you're in the midst of a fire. It's hard to find your way out of a forest when you're standing still in the middle of a forest, not knowing which way to go. You're not sure whether to go north or south, because if you go north, you feel like you should have went south. Excuse me. And that just, stopped me from being unpacked. But unpacked has always been on my mind, not just in my life, having more stories to come across, with my ACL journey at, one vivid moment. I couldn't get my extension, at all, and the day I was supposed to have a test before my 3 month appointment, the leg was bent, one of the most bent times it was in the past few weeks. And hearing, yeah, you don't want to hear the results, they're going to be bad. You walked in with the bent leg, it set me down, it set me off. I was in the car just mad on the way back, not understanding, just wondering, like, God, like, you put this on my path, and I understand, I probably should be doing so much more, but 3 months, I'm hearing, you should never compare your timelines, especially in the ACL journey. But I'm hearing people are running, people are lifting, and I'm struggling to just get my extension, and I still haven't even got it, It's still, I laid my leg out straight. It's still up a little bit, and obviously I'm going to work on that and hopefully get it back soon. But I remember that next day, just going to sleep, not wondering, that next day knowing I have to drive home to get my 3 month and my legs bent 24 hours. And I'm just, yeah, this is going to be terrible. My surgeon's not going to like this or anything. And I remember waking up and my leg was just straight. And I'm like, oh, it's just me waking up. Luckily, I got a 3 hour car ride home. My leg's gonna get bent right where it was. I remember driving all the way back. I had a few stops and driving all the way back and hopping out at the hospital and just like seeing like, oh, my leg's pretty straight. Like, I'm confident now. Like, he might like this, or it's probably still not exactly where it should be, but it's far better than yesterday. And just going in there and hearing from the surgeon, like, I'm happy where you're at. We could be better, but maybe start doing some of these things. It'll help. And that's where I'm at now. I've 1 week out of having lifts, back doing leg days. I missed I never knew how much fun leg days were. Being a soccer player, I hated leg days. Now I enjoy them. I look forward to them. I almost went and did a leg day today. If the gym was open for another hour, I would have went. But, back to Unpacked, it's always been on my mind, just trying to really now build a foundation that I know I can fall back on. If I have where lows are gonna happen, hard periods are gonna happen. I just want something that I can fall back on. I've been back in my, journal, just writing down a lot of things and a lot of different ideas that I've had, a lot of different ideas that, I want to do. One of my main problems was, how did I want to structure Unpacked? Obviously I don't want Unpacked to be like any other. I don't want it to be lost like any other, anything like that. So founding the foundation of it. How am I going to curate different conversations with so many different people? I can't sit and have many questions on somebody that, I reached out to luckily on Instagram and got an interview in 3 days. They may not be on Google, they may not be on Twitter where I could go get a list of questions. It's something that I want a foundation where I could consistently ask different people, business owners, creatives, athletes, and even, something I thought of, being able to go out in person and have conversations with people on the street. What's a foundation or what's an idea that I could follow to have that? Things evolve constantly. Things are constantly changing and evolving. How Unpacked may start now, in another month or 2 months, 4 months, I could have another foundation that I like a lot more, for Unpack. So that's just something that I've been really working on. I even came up with my own, little quote when I was working on this. You got to unpack moments to further understand the emotional and the moment. I built on to that as well. You got to unpack these moments to further understand your emotions, to further understand what this moment is trying to teach you. If you live with a moment, in that moment, boom, my phone, my window cracks, and I go over there and fix it. A few days later, I may revisit, why did my window crack? How did I feel in that moment? My window may have cracked because I had something leaning against it. I may have a heater outside and it's cold. And, so many different things you could look at and unpack why or what you're meant to learn from this. My ACL journey, I'm constantly unpacking a lot of things. A few weeks ago, I actually rewatched me walking off a soccer field as a player for the last time. Now that I've, became a coach, it was something that I just felt like one random night you need to watch you walking off the field as an athlete one more time. I ever since ACL, the surgery, the moment it happened, the only clip that I watch, the only clips I watch, excuse me, were probably me initially tearing it and then my body telling me, it's over. And those are the clips that I stopped at. I never watched me walking off the soccer field for the last time as a player. You may could say senior night, oh, you played senior night, but like senior night, what I kicked the ball off and ran off the field, that's nothing. But for the actual time of me walking off the field from the moment I went down, the trainer coming out, my teammates coming over and walking off the field, and I'm walking off, I had to relive that moment. And you may have, did you feel angry? Did you feel sad? I felt serenity. I felt calm. I felt the weight lifted off my shoulders, oddly enough. Obviously I can't go back and change it, so it's happened, but it's just like, dang, it feels like an old me walking off the field, and now this is a new me watching this. That was the old person walking off the field. That was the old me leaving the game, opening a door for the new me. So, just going back and unpacking moments of your life. There are so many moments that I could go to, moments all the way back to my senior year of high school, life-changing moments. But just understanding what Unpacked to be and building that foundation is something that I've really been working on. Obviously this channel is a lot more than Unpacked as well. I document my life sometimes. I'm working on something special, that I found special in my heart. But, just finding the love and having fun with this again. Ultimately, I didn't know if this was something that I should be doing, and I just questioned, what I should be doing. But I learned, how can I question what I should be doing when maybe this is just what I need to do in the moment? What I should be doing isn't right now, but right now this is what I should be doing, to find what I need to do or find what I'm meant to do. So I'm glad to be back and Unpacked. It's still a lot of work going, finding guests and people to discuss with, or conversate with, as I like to say. I don't like, interviews or anything. I like having conversations, so, I have a foundation that I like, to go into that we're going to follow. And one thing is, a signature question, a question that I can ask anybody and everybody, on the street, on a conversation, athletes, creators, whatever the case may be. And that signature question is, what's a moment in your life that you still revisit and unpack today? What's a moment in your life that you're still unpacking? And for me, I would say it was the death of my uncle. You may have thought, oh, your ACL this, your ACL that, but the ACL is, it was kind of the ending of my athlete story. Your athlete story, athletes know, you're not an athlete your entire life. You get to 30, realistically, you're done being an athlete, or 40. Shout out Braun. But, as an athlete, my ACL hurts, or my ACL, that journey hurts. This journey hurts. I would have loved to play my senior season, but I knew internally as well that I needed to, rediscover myself, come December when I graduated or ultimately finished my season. But all of that stopped, and it allowed me the time to do that. But the death, I would say I constantly revisit and unpack that today, because it is something that constantly, changes. So many people were involved. So many people were impacted, and, it was almost like a domino effect in a lot of other areas, the loss of, my uncle, it hurts, being so young and you don't expect that. And, just the situation that was occurred, it's somebody that you miss or you never would have thought would, leave so early, and I constantly revisit that and just look at, my reaction that night and just, me today, and his daughter, I have so much love for her, and it just in that moment as well, it showed me how simple life is, but how grateful you need to be for life. People pass every day. A lot of people face loss. A lot of people face loved ones lost. And it just shows you got to be grateful every day for life. Grateful for your own life and the people around you, family, friends, even your dog. And speaking of dog, like if you ask me, one person or one thing that constantly saved your life, I would easily tell you my dog. Just in a simple, you can answer your family, and I can write whole essays on my family members and things like that. But my dog is one thing that has showed me, along with my uncle, like how simple life is. Like my dog, who knows how many words he truly understands, but he just be happy to be awake. He wakes, he sees you, instantly wags his tail because he's awake for another day and he gets to do other things, and it just makes life so grateful. I'm so grateful for life, just in general. but also understanding you only have one. And I hear a lot of people be nervous to do what they want to do, or nervous of the voices of other people, but you only have one life just as much as them. If you find something fun, or you find something funny, or you want to go do something, go do it. Life is amazing. It gets hard. It definitely does get hard, but the hard moments are some of the best moments, because you look back and you got through those hard moments. My ACL, I never thought I would even have surgery. I didn't want to have surgery. I said I wasn't getting surgery because I was scared and I was nervous of what surgery would have looked like. But here I am getting through it. When I lost my uncle, I didn't know how I was going to get through it. I went to a whole practice that day, just not even getting my body to be able to kick a ball, and eventually I was able to hop in drills and finish that day. Was it hard? But yes, but I look back and see the strength that I gained from that. The strength that I'm constantly gaining from that, the things that I'm constantly gaining. So that's a signature question we're gonna look to ask everybody we conversate with. And the last thing, we're gonna figure out solo episodes, like things like this. Like, this is all, you go look at my TikTok, little insight, my Preem Virtue autobiography, everything that I document is something that I want to hear. It's something that I need to hear. That's where you get some of your best ideas. I gotta figure out solo episodes. There are a lot of ideas, that I have, that I'm constantly working on. That I'm gonna work on here a few after I get off here, but I'm so happy to reintroduce Unpacked. This is the Unpacked Reboot. I thought of a name change, but I just love Unpacked so much because, it's just it just fits, in my eyes. You unpack coming from vacation, you unpack all the fantastic memories you just had. You unpack your gym bag and you find things that you thought you lost, whatever the case may be. So we're gonna stick with Unpacked, and I'm excited to see, the growth that happens, not just for Unpacked or as a brand, i.e., but, for me building Unpacked and seeing where I could take it, or, how I could change it. And it's something that when you think of Unpacked, you think of, me, or you think of the positive idea of just sharing stories and human connection. So please, if you have anything, please let me know. I'm always open to new things. I love learning new things. I'm always open to, criticism, as you may call it. But welcome back to Unpacked.